The man chuckled, unbothered. I can see you're not in the mood for small talk, so let's be direct. His eyes sharpened. I'm here for the boy. A cold pulse moved through Ion's veins. You're not taking him. That's not your decision, the man said calmly. I have rights. You have nothing, Ion hissed. No claim, no authority. The man stepped closer, lowering his voice. He's mine. I raised him. I fed him. I sheltered him. And his mother, his smirk grew darker. She knew better than to run. Ion's fist tightened. She tried to protect her son from you. The man shrugged. She made her choice. And she paid for it. Ion felt rage flare so hot he had to breathe twice to keep control. You hurt her, he said quietly. I disciplined her, the man corrected, as if discussing an unruly pet. But she became troublesome. And when someone becomes troublesome, you kill them? Ion finished. The man smiled, not denying it. So, he said, brushing dust off his sleeve, bring me the boy. No, Ion replied. No, the stranger lifted his eyebrows. You're a soldier. You understand how this works. I take what belongs to me. And that child, he's not yours. The man's eyes glinted. He's not yours either. A heavy silence stretched between them. Finally, the man leaned closer, his voice dropping into something low and venomous. Listen carefully, I will take him one day. When you're asleep, when she's distracted, when no one can stop me, and when that day comes, Captain, you'll regret standing in my way. Ion didn't move, not even when the man smirked and stepped back. You have something that belongs to me, the man said, and I always reclaim what's mine. With that, he turned and walked toward a dark car parked down the lane. He opened the door, gave Ion one last cold smile, and drove off. Ion stood there long after the car disappeared, breathing hard, the man's words echoing through him like poison. He didn't move until he heard the faint whisper of a sob inside the house. He turned sharply and went in. Miriam stood in the hallway, Rafi pressed tightly against her shoulder. She had heard everything. Maybe not the words, but enough. Ion closed the door behind him, locking it slowly, deliberately. Miriam's voice trembled. No, Ion said. He isn't. Her eyes shone with fear. What do we do now? Ion stepped forward, placing a steady hand on her arm. Oh, he said, we fight back. With truth. With protection. With the law. With whatever it takes. But he's dangerous, she whispered. So am I, Ion replied quietly. And he just made a mistake coming here. Rafi lifted his head then, looking between them with wide, uncertain eyes. Ion knelt to meet him. Rafi, he said gently, no one is going to take you. Not while I'm here. The boy's lips trembled. A promise. Ion rested a hand over the child's small shoulder, and for the first time, Rafi didn't pull away. I promise, he whispered. And in that fragile moment of trust, Ion felt the truth settle deep inside him. This wasn't just Miriam's fight, or Rafi's past catching up. It was now his war, and he intended to win it. By noon, the entire neighborhood knew. Ion felt the shift before he saw it. The stares, the murmurs, the quiet glances from windows as he walked down the street to speak with the community elder. When he stepped onto the main road, two women who had always greeted Miriam kindly suddenly crossed to the opposite side, whispering behind their hands. A shopkeeper paused mid-gesture when Ion approached, stiffening in the doorway as though unsure whether to offer respect or distance. Then he heard it. He came back from the dead only to find his wife with another man's child. No, I heard she ran away for months while he was gone. And maybe the child really is hers. Look at his age. Poor Ion. Imagine returning from war to such shame. Ion stopped walking. Their words, sharp, careless, struck him slowly at first. Then all at once, filling the air like shards of broken glass. He waited, letting them continue because sometimes listening revealed more than questions did. He's pretending nothing's wrong. He shouldn't have left her so long. Women get lonely. The boy doesn't even call him Baba. That tells you everything. Ion turned his face away, jaw clenched, the taste of bitterness rising in his throat. They judged with half-seen glimpses, with assumptions sharpened by boredom and gossip. But what hurt wasn't their words. It was the quiet realization that these same voices must have surrounded Miriam during his absence, pressuring, accusing, twisting her grief into something shameful. She had carried all of that alone. The weight of it tightened in his chest. He continued walking, not trusting himself to speak to anyone yet. When he returned home, he found Miriam sitting by the window, a small cup of tea untouched beside her, her shoulders slumped forward as though something heavy pressed down on them. She didn't hear him at first, too lost in thought, until her breath hitched and she wiped her cheek quickly, as if trying to erase proof of tears. He approached gently. They pretended to be concerned, but you know how people speak when they want to hide their cruelty as kindness. What did they say? He asked, taking a seat beside her. Miriam stared at her hands. They asked if Raffi is really mine. If I betrayed you. If I brought shame to your name. They said I should come clean before you learn the truth. Her voice quivered. They think I'm hiding an affair. Ion's breath thinned. You're not. She looked up slowly, eyes full of sorrow. But they don't believe me. Do you think I don't believe you? He asked, softer this time. Her lips parted, trembling. I don't know. Sometimes your silence scares me more than their words. Ion exhaled, the guilt of not saying enough settling like dust over his shoulders. And Miriam, I'm trying to understand everything. I'm trying to make sense of what you've endured. But I never doubted your loyalty. Not once. Her face softened, but the doubt in her eyes was not fully gone. Before he could say more, Raffi peeked around the corner of the hallway, holding his small stuffed toy by the ear. His eyes searched for Miriam first, then for Ion, as if confirming both were still there, still safe. When he approached them, he climbed silently onto the sofa, curling against Miriam's side. She folded her arm around him automatically. The boy lifted his head slightly. Mama, are people angry? Miriam froze, eyes widening as though struck. No, Beta, they're not angry. Raffi nestled closer. I heard them talking outside. They said bad things. Ion leaned forward. What did you hear? Raffi looked at him, fearful of giving the wrong answer. They said I don't belong here. The words sliced through the room like a sudden drop in temperature. Miriam gathered him tightly, whispering, Don't listen to them. They don't know the truth. Raffi's small fingers clung to her shirt. But if I don't belong, will you send me away? Her breath broke. Never. Never, Raffi. Ion watched the way the child buried himself in her, the way she held him with fierce, trembling protectiveness, and something inside him shifted. Slow and painful. They weren't choosing each other out of convenience or desperation. They were bound by survival. He reached out and placed a hand gently on Raffi's back. The boy stiffened but didn't pull away. Raffi, Ion said softly, no one decides where you belong. Not neighbors, not strangers, not people who speak without knowing anything. His voice deepened. You belong with us. The boy blinked, tears gathering at the corners of his eyes, but he nodded and pressed closer. For a moment, all three of them stayed like that. Quiet, breathing, the same uncertain air, until a sudden knock sounded again at the door. Not sharp, not threatening, but urgent. Ion rose, motioning for Miriam to stay back, and opened the door to find Mrs. Durrani, an older widow and longtime neighbor, standing with a worried frown. Mian, I need to speak with you, she said quickly. About that man who came earlier. Ion stiffened. What about him? You recognized him, she whispered. He's been coming around town for months, asking questions, watching the house, speaking to people who shouldn't be trusted. Ion's heart began to race. Did anyone tell him anything? The widow hesitated before nodding. Some did. Some told him rumors. The kind that spread quickly. Miriam joined them at the doorway, holding Raffi's hand protectively. Mrs. Durrani looked at her with a mixture of sorrow and guilt. People said you vanished for a night. They said you brought the child from somewhere else. They said you refused to explain anything. You didn't explain because I was terrified, Miriam whispered. And that made the rumors worse, the widow said gently. They believed the worst because you stayed silent. Ion understood exactly what she meant. Silence had created a void, and the void had been filled with poison. Is that why the man came to our door? Ion asked. Mrs. Durrani's expression tightened. He told people he was your wife's friend, that he had come to help her while you were gone. And when she brought home the child, well, he made them question everything. Miriam closed her eyes, inhaling sharply. He planned all of it, she whispered. Even the rumors. Ion clenched his jaw. The stranger wasn't just dangerous. He was manipulative, calculating, shaping the town's perception, so Miriam's credibility would crumble before she ever had a chance to defend herself. Mrs. Durrani placed a hand on Miriam's arm. Oh, my dear, you should have come to me. You were never alone. Miriam's voice broke. I didn't know who to trust. Ion gently wrapped his arm around her shoulder. For the first time, Miriam didn't flinch from his touch. She leaned into him slightly, allowing herself that fragile moment of support. The widow sighed. People will keep talking, Ion. They always do. But talk won't hurt you as much as silence will. If you want to protect your family, you need to come forward with the truth. Ion nodded slowly. And we will. After the widow left, the door closed softly behind her. Miriam sank onto the sofa, rubbing her temples as though the weight of the world was pressing down. Everything is falling apart, she whispered. I know, Ion said softly, sitting beside her. Everything is being revealed. What if people turn against us? She asked, voice trembling. Then let them, he replied. What matters is that we stand together. Raffi climbed into her lap again, his small arms wrapping around her waist. Ion reached out and brushed a strand of hair from Miriam's face. She looked up, startled, but did not pull away. The storm isn't outside, he said quietly. It's the misunderstandings between us. And we're ending that now. For a brief moment, her eyes softened. The distance between them, the silence, the secrets, the uncertainty, seemed to shrink just enough for hope to breathe. But outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees, carrying whispers of a brewing conflict neither of them fully understood yet. And Ion knew one thing with certainty. The man who wanted the boy wasn't the town's only challenge. The biggest storm was the one threatening to divide them, from within. The evening settled over the house like a fragile veil, stretched thin by everything that had happened. Ion locked every door and window, checking each latch twice before returning to the living room where Miriam and Raffi sat quietly. The lamps glowed dimly, their warm light unable to fully soften the tension that clung to the walls. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint sound of distant traffic, a reminder that the world continued moving even when their own had narrowed to fear and survival. Raffi held a small wooden toy between his hands, twisting it gently. His shoulders were hunched, his eyes distant, as if his thoughts lived somewhere far behind the trembling surface of his expression. Miriam stroked his hair with a tenderness born of both comfort and desperation. She glanced at Ion when he re-entered the room, silently asking if he'd seen anything outside. He shook his head. No threats, but no safety either. Ion sat beside them, keeping a slight distance so Raffi wouldn't feel cornered. The boy's breaths came shallow, shaky, like someone trying to hold back memories clawing their way up from the dark. After a moment, he spoke first, his voice almost too faint to hear. And Mama, that bad uncle, he will come again? Miriam's hand stilled, pain tightening across her face. Before she could answer, Ion leaned slightly closer, keeping his tone soft. Raffi, he won't take you. Not while we're here. The boy's bottom lip trembled. He always finds us. A cold whisper of dread slid through the room. Ion swallowed, steadying his voice. You've seen him before. Many times, haven't you? Raffi nodded, eyes focused on the toy in his lap. He comes when there is no light. When Mama says I should sleep. When the door makes loud sounds. Miriam inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around Raffi's small shoulder. Beta, you don't have to think about those things. But Raffi continued, as if something inside him had finally reached its breaking point. He was angry at Amy, very angry. He shouted. And the room was cold, and Amy cried, but she tried to hide it. Ion felt the air shift, thickening like the stillness before a storm breaks. He exchanged a look with Miriam, fear, pain, guilt, all blending. But the boy kept speaking, lost in the rising tide of memory. He said I belonged to him, Raffi whispered. That he could lock the door and take me away forever. Amy said no. She said he must leave. She held my hand. Very tight. Miriam shut her eyes, her body trembling. Ion moved slightly closer, ready to steady her if she faltered. Raffi picked up another toy piece, twisting it hard as though trying to twist the memory itself. He got so mad. He threw things. He kicked a chair. Amy told me to hide. His voice shrank. I went behind the curtain, and I was quiet. So quiet. Ion's chest tightened painfully. What happened next? Raffi didn't look up. There was shouting. Loud. And then something broke. A glass. I heard it. Amy screamed. I think she fell. Miriam covered her mouth, muffling a sob. The boy glanced up at the sound, startled, then leaned into her as though he feared he'd said something wrong. Mama, did I make you sad? He whispered. No. Miriam whispered, voice cracking. No, Beta, you didn't. You're brave for telling. Ion gently rested a hand on the back of the sofa, grounding himself. Raffi, did the woman, your Amy, try to protect you? The boy nodded slowly. She pushed me behind her. She told him he could not take me. She held me tight. Then she ran out of the house with me. We ran and ran. My feet hurt and my chest hurt. But she didn't stop. His voice broke. She said we had to reach the buses. She said someone would help us. Ian felt a lump forming in his throat. And then, Rafi rubbed his face, the confusion of memory blurring the edges. She was scared. She kept looking behind her. She told me not to look, but I did. And he was behind us, far but coming. Rafi shivered. She said, "Don't cry." But I was crying too much. Miriam held him tightly, rocking him gently. "It's okay, sweetheart. You don't have to tell us everything." But Rafi continued, voice hollow, almost trance-like now. When we reached the station, she hid me behind the wall. She told me to be brave. She said she loved me. She told me to wait, his small fingers curled into fists. Then she didn't come back. Ian felt something inside him shift, an ache so deep it felt like a bruise across his ribs. "That's when Miriam found you?" Rafi nodded, his voice sinking into a whisper. "It was raining, I was cold. I kept calling her, but she didn't answer. And when I saw Mama," he looked up at Miriam, eyes filled with raw, fragile trust. "I thought she came back for me. But she was different." Miriam's tears fell freely now, her hand trembling as she cupped his cheek. "Oh, Rafi, I'm so sorry you had to go through that." The boy leaned into her touch, closing his eyes. For the first time, he did not flinch when Ian gently placed his hand upon his back. "And the man?" Anne asked softly. "Do you remember what he did? What he said when you were running?" Rafi hesitated, then whispered the words like a secret etched in fear. He said, "If he caught me, I wouldn't see light again." He swallowed, voice trembling. He said, "He would keep me in the dark forever." Miriam gasped, covering her heart, her breath break. Ian felt rage coil inside him, slow and silent, like the tightening of a trigger. But Rafi wasn't finished. "When Mama took me home," he whispered, "he came again later. He knocked. He said my real Mama didn't want me. He said I was trouble. He said I make people die." And Miriam's sob broke through the quiet. "And no," she whispered fiercely, clutching the boy. "And no one died because of you. You hear me? No one." Rafi shook his head as if trying to push the poison out of his ears. "But he said if I wasn't born, she would still be alive." Ian felt every muscle in his body turn rigid. The room seemed to shrink around them. Miriam lowered her forehead to Rafi's, her tears falling onto his cheeks. "That's a lie," Ian said firmly, his voice cracked with emotion but steady. "Your mother died protecting you. That makes you precious, not dangerous." Rafi looked at him with wide, searching eyes. "But wait, why did he want me back?" Ian inhaled, steadying himself. "Because some people don't know how to love. They only know how to own." His voice deepened. "And you are not his to own." The boy trembled and finally leaned toward Ian, just slightly, as if the instinct to seek safety outweighed the habit of fear. Ian placed his hand over Rafi's small shoulder again. Miriam looked at Ian through tear-filled eyes, something shifting between them, an unspoken understanding, a shared wound, and a fragile new trust. Rafi sniffled, pressing closer. "I'm an uncle. Can you keep him away?" Miriam opened her mouth, but it was Ian who answered first, quiet but solid as stone. "Yes," he said. "We will." Rafi rested his head in Miriam's lap, exhausted from remembering too much too young. She stroked his hair until his breathing slowed into sleep, and to sleep. Ian watched them both, the fragile peace in that moment settling around him like a vow. He rose slowly, turning off the lamp, letting the room dim into soft shadow. But inside him, something had ignited. He now knew the depth of the man's cruelty. He now understood the terror that shaped Rafi's every breath. He now saw the truth behind the bruises, the nightmares, the fear of footsteps. And he also knew something else. This wasn't just a man trying to reclaim a child. This was a monster protecting his secret. Ian glanced at the locked door, his jaw tightening, and he intended to tear every one of those secrets into the light. Night crept silently over the house, settling into corners, like a lingering omen. After Rafi's confession, the air felt heavier, thick with truths too painful for a child to carry and too dark for adults to ignore. Ian moved through each room with careful precision, checking windows, testing locks, noting every weak point the house might have. His training sharpened every instinct. Something in the air had shifted. The quiet was not peace, it was warning. Miriam tried to put Rafi to sleep, but the boy clung to her with trembling hands, afraid to close his eyes in case the darkness swallowed him whole. She hummed softly, her voice fragile but steady, weaving comfort into the night, even as fear tightened her own breath. When he finally fell asleep, curled against her chest like a child half his age, she remained sitting beside him, unwilling to move. Ian watched from the doorway, the tenderness in her posture breaking something inside him. She had carried too much alone. Now she carried Raffi and the ghost that hunted them. Miriam, he whispered, careful not to wake the child. I'll come sit with me. You need rest too. She looked at him with exhaustion etched deep into her features, but nodded slowly. After gently laying Raffi onto his pillow, she followed Ion into the living room. The dim lamplight cast soft shadows across the walls, revealing the quiet trembling in her shoulders. She wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold her fear together. What if he comes again tonight? She asked softly. Then he'll find me waiting, Ion replied. Her eyes lifted to his, searching for reassurance, and she found it. Steady, unwavering, the kind of calm that came from someone who'd faced the darkest moments on battlefields, far away. Only now the war had come to him, and the enemy was not wielding guns, but something far more insidious. Miriam lowered herself onto the sofa, her fingers tracing the edge of her shawl. Ian, I didn't just take Raffi out of pity. I took him because I knew. I knew if I didn't, he wouldn't survive. Her voice quivered as though the fear still lived inside her skin. When he clung to me that night, calling me Amy, I felt something break open inside me. Something I didn't know could still feel. Ion sat beside her, close enough to offer warmth, but not overwhelming. You don't have to justify loving him? She shook her head. I thought you would see him as a burden, as something that replaced what we couldn't have. Her voice softened. We always wanted a child, Ion, and when they told me you were gone, he reached out gently, hesitating before touching her trembling hand. You don't need to explain that either. But she did. He saw it in her eyes, the weight she wanted to surrender, the story she had forced into silence. I felt like the world had ended, she whispered. And then that boy. He needed me in a way that made the loneliness stop crushing me. Tears filled her eyes. A loving him didn't erase you. It kept me breathing until the miracle of you walking through that door. Ion's chest tightened. He wanted to take her pain into his own hands, scatter it into dust until it no longer touched her. But before he could speak, a sudden sound echoed from outside. A soft crunch of gravel. Footsteps. Miriam jolted, her hand flying to her mouth. Ion rose in an instant, every muscle sharpening with alertness. He moved to the window and peeked through the narrow slit between the curtains. The street was empty at a glance, but he felt the presence, seen or unseen, the way soldiers sense danger even before it revealed itself. He motioned for Miriam to move away from the window. She obeyed, her breath shaky, her fingers gripping the edge of the sofa. Then came the knock. Not violent like before. Not polite like the morning. This one was calculated. A slow, echoing thud that slid under the skin like ice. Ion exchanged a glance with Miriam. Her eyes were wide with terror, her lips parted in a silent plea. He stepped toward the door. The moment his hand touched the knob, a voice slithered through the wood. And Miriam opened the door. Her knees buckled. Ion had to grab her arm to steady her. The man spoke again, voice dripping with confidence. I know you're awake. Raffi began crying in the bedroom, sensing fear even in his sleep. Ion kept his voice low. Take Raffi and stay in the bed. Do not open the door until I tell you. I know, she whispered, clutching his arm. You don't know what he's capable of. I don't need to know, Ion replied. I only need him to understand what I'm capable of. Andy. She hesitated. Fear, love, and trust battling within her, before nodding and hurrying to Raffi. The knock came again. Ion unlocked the door but kept the chain. He opened it only an inch. The man stood outside, illuminated by the faint moonlight. His expression was calm, collected, as though he were greeting an old friend, but his eyes, dark, unblinking, held the cold certainty of someone who believed the world belonged to him. You have something of mine, he said simply. Ion didn't blink. You need to leave, or what? The man asked, tilting his head. You think being a soldier scares me? No, Ion replied. But it should. The man smirked, stepping closer until his shadow spilled into the doorway. You're interfering in something that doesn't concern you. Protecting my family always concerns me. At the word family, the man's face twitched. She's not your family. Not anymore. She survived because I let her. Ion's blood turned to fire, but before he could respond, the man's voice dropped to a chilling whisper. And the boy is mine. By right. By blood. Ion's brows drew together. Blood? The man smiled. I raised him from birth. I paid for him. Does that not make him mine? Ion felt his stomach twist. Paid? Children aren't free. the man said lightly, as though discussing a market transaction. His mother owed me. She ran before repaying her debt. A grim silence settled between them. You killed her, Yoon said quietly. The man shrugged. As she chose to die, she shouldn't have run. Ian gripped the doorframe to keep himself from launching forward. You won't touch that boy. I already have, the man whispered. He remembers. And so does she. Behind Ion, a floorboard creaked inside the house. The man's gaze slid past him. Miriam stood in the hallway, frozen mid-step. Raffi clutched in her arms. The man's eyes lit up. On Miriam, he breathed as though tasting her fear. You look pale. Tired. Have they been telling you lies about me? She shook her head, trembling. Aleve? Ian growled, but the man ignored him. His eyes stayed locked on Miriam. You kept something from Raffi whimpered, burying his face in her shoulder, and then faster than a blink, the man lunged for the door. Ion slammed it shut just in time. The impact rattled the hinges, and the man pounded against the wood, shouting now, voice wild with rage. Give him to me. You can't hide him forever. Wayne, Miriam cried. Take him to the bedroom. Ion yelled back, bracing the door with all his strength. She ran, Raffi wailing. The man kept hitting the door, again and again, until Ion feared the chain might snap. Rage burned through every strike, through every word spat between blows. But then in the silence, Ion held still, breath-sharp, listening. A faint laugh echoed from the other side. You can't protect her, the man whispered. Miriam. A car door slammed. An engine roared. The vehicle sped into the night. Ion stayed at the door for a full minute, muscles tense, until he was certain the danger was gone, for now. When he finally turned, he found Miriam and Raffi huddled in the hallway, both shaking. Raffi sobbed into her chest, and Miriam's eyes glistened with terror and guilt. She whispered, He won't stop. Ion took them both into his arms, pulling them close. No, he whispered into their hair, voice fierce and trembling. But neither will I. For the first time since coming home, he held them both. Not just as protector, not just as husband or stranger, but as someone who finally understood what he was fighting for. In what he stood to lose. The house felt bruised after the night's violence, its walls still trembling with the echo of fists against wood, its silence carrying the faint memory of Raffi's terrified sobs. Morning light crept slowly across the floor, hesitant, as though afraid to touch the places where fear had settled thick and stubborn. Ion hadn't slept. He sat against the living room wall, one knee raised, listening for the smallest disturbance outside. Dawn had arrived, but his instincts told him danger rarely honored sunlight. Miriam sat on the carpet a few feet away. Raffi curled in her lap like a child trying to disappear inside her. She had spent the night rocking him, whispering comforts. She barely believed herself. The exhaustion etched across her face was deep, raw, not just from lack of sleep, but from years of carrying pain in silence. Ion watched them both, a heaviness in his chest that no battlefield had ever put there. The way Miriam cradled Raffi, the quiet sob she hid against his hair, the way the boy's small fingers clung to her shawl, it all formed a picture of a family stitched together through fear, survival, and a love that grew out of necessity and instinct. He rose slowly, stretching stiff muscles, and approached them. Miriam lifted her head, eyes rimmed red, but she tried to offer him a small, broken smile. You should rest, she murmured. So should you, he replied gently. She glanced down at Raffi. I can't. Ian sat across from her, close enough to offer warmth without crowding her. Raffi peeked up at him, still wary, still trembling, but there was something new in his eyes. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. Ion was no longer just a stranger in the house. He was someone who had stood between them and danger. Very softly, Ion said, He won't come today. And not after the noise he made last night. Someone would have reported it. A bitter, humorless sound escaped Miriam's lips. People here report gossip faster than threats. He didn't deny it. He knew she was right. Still, he reached out, slowly, giving her time, and touched her forearm. The contact was light, but she stiffened for a moment before slowly relaxing beneath his touch. Miriam, we need to talk, he said quietly. Her breath faltered. About what? About the truth, he replied. But not the truth that hurts. The truth that heals. The words seemed to unravel her. She lowered her gaze, fingers brushing gently through Raffi's hair. Don't know if I have the strength to dig through everything again. You don't have to do it alone, he murmured. A long, trembling silence filled the room. Finally, she nodded. Ian leaned back slightly. You said you thought I was dead. The whole town believed it, but I don't understand how the rumors were so certain, and how none of your letters reached me, and none of mine reached you. Miriam lifted her eyes to his. The sadness there was deep, but underneath it, a flicker of recognition that she too had wondered, suffered, questioned. I used to go to the post office every week, she said quietly. Sometimes twice. I kept asking if news had come from your unit, if any soldier had written, but they always shook their heads. They? Ayn asked. She nodded. At the postmaster's assistants. And that man, the one from the photograph, he came there too. Often. Ayan's jaw tightened. He was watching you even then? He seemed friendly at first, she said, shame flickering briefly over her features. He told me he knew people in high places, that he could help get news of you. I didn't trust him, but I was desperate. One day he came up to me with papers, saying he heard from someone in your unit. He said your name was on the list of casualties. Ayan felt his breath leave him for a moment. And you believed him. I didn't want to, she whispered. But he described your unit. He knew where you were stationed. He knew things only someone close to the military would know. Ayan shut his eyes, because he intercepted the letters. Miriam swallowed, voice trembling. He must have. The postmaster died months later. Heart attack, they said. After that, everything changed. People stopped asking me questions. They stopped offering help. They just gave me those looks, the ones that say they pity you, but don't want your sorrow touching them. Ayan felt fury rising inside him, not at her, but at the calculated cruelty of a man who had isolated her, broken her spirit, then hunted her when she found someone else to protect. He took a slow breath. It wasn't your fault, Miriam. None of it. She shook her head, tears slipping silently down her cheek. Ayan, I was losing myself, every day. When Rafi came into my life, he gave me something to hold on to. But the guilt of loving him while thinking I'd lost you, it tore me in two. You didn't betray me, he repeated, voice firm. You were surviving grief. Her lips parted, trembling. And sometimes I thought, maybe if I had waited a little longer, if I had doubted the rumors more. She choked on the words. Maybe none of this would have happened. Maybe his mother would still be alive. Maybe a Miriam. Ayan moved closer, placing both hands gently on her shoulders. Stop blaming yourself for a monster's sins. She tried to speak, but the lump in her throat held her voice hostage. A sob escaped before she could stop it. She covered her mouth, shaking, as years of fear and shame finally cracked open. Ayan reached forward and pulled her into his arms. She didn't resist. She collapsed against him, crying into his chest. Quiet, shattering sobs that made his own breath hitch. He held her tightly, his chin resting lightly atop her head, grounding her through every tremor. Rafi watched with wide, uncertain eyes, sensing that this wasn't fear but release. Slowly, hesitantly, he crawled closer and pressed his tiny hand against Miriam's back, an instinctive gesture of comfort. Ayan's arm instinctively curved around the boy as well. For a long time, the three of them stayed like that, woven together in a fragile, trembling embrace that felt like the beginning of something mending. When Miriam's sobs softened, she pulled back slightly, wiping her cheeks. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm sorry, she whispered. Don't apologize, Ayan said. You've been carrying all of this on your own. Anyone would break under it. Her eyes were swollen, but for the first time since his return, they held a spark of relief. A quiet flicker of hope. Ayan continued, voice soft but sure. There's something else I need to tell you. She looked up. You read all your letters, he said. The ones you wrote to me, the ones you never received from me. Her breath stilled. He took those too, Ayan whispered. He didn't just want the boy. He wanted to isolate you. He wanted you to believe you had no one. Miriam closed her eyes, tears reappearing, but softer this time, not from despair, but from understanding. Ayan gently wiped one from her cheek. He failed. She opened her eyes, breath trembling. Did he? Yes, he murmured. Because I'm here now. Because you're not alone. Because whatever he stole, we can rebuild. Her fingers curled around his wrist, fragile but intentional. And Rafi? She whispered. Ayan looked at the boy. Small, scared, but brave enough to stay in the room, brave enough to reach for comfort. He's ours now, Ayan said softly. And not by blood. By choice. Something broke inside her again, but this time it was not fear. It was relief. A truth that didn't wound, it healed. A truth she had needed for too long. Ayan brushed her hair back gently. We're family now. And families protect one another. Outside, the world was still dangerous. The man was still out there, His threat still echoed, but inside this house something had shifted. Something had strengthened, and for the first time since Ion returned home, the weight they carried did not feel like a burden one person had to bear. It felt shared. It felt possible. Taden felt possible. It felt like the beginning of something whole. A truth that healed, not hurt. The hours after their shared truth passed with a strange, delicate quiet, like the stillness after a storm when the world hasn't yet decided whether to break open again or let the light in. Ion moved through the house with a new awareness attuned not just to danger, but to the fragile threads connecting the three of them. Every time Raffi clung to Miriam, every time she touched his hair with that assured gentleness, every time the boy's eyes flicked toward Ion with growing bravery, something in the house shifted, slowly, cautiously, toward healing. But outside, the man's shadow lingered. Ion felt it in the way the neighbors' whispers crowded the silence, in the way the wind carried distant footsteps at night, in the way the post office clerk stiffened when he walked in to ask for records of lost letters. The town's gossip swirled restlessly, hungry for a story, but no one knew the truth except the three living inside it. By late afternoon, Ion made a decision, a choice, not formed from anger, but from a deeper, steadier place inside him. He would no longer defend the child and Miriam in silence. He would fight, publicly, legally, and relentlessly, and they would choose each other through it all. He returned home to find Miriam standing in the courtyard, rinsing laundry in a steel basin while Raffi played by her feet, stacking small stones into towers only to topple them again. Even the simple act of watching them filled Ion with a warmth he hadn't expected to feel again so soon after coming home. A warmth threaded with protectiveness, reverence, and something dangerously close to love. "Where did you go?" Miriam asked quietly, not turning as he approached. "To speak with a lawyer," he said, "and the officer at the station." Her hands froze above the basin. Slowly, she looked up at him. "About everything?" "Everything." Raffi paused in his play, his small fingers brushing the stones like a question. "Are we in trouble? Are we in trouble?" Ion crouched beside him, his voice soft. "Not you, little one. Never you. We're trying to keep you safe." Raffi nodded, satisfied enough to return to his game, though his eyes stayed close to both of them as if needing their presence to anchor him. Miriam wiped her hands on her shawl, tension lining her shoulders. "What did the officer say?" "That they'll need a statement," Ion answered. "From you. From me. And eventually from Raffi." She swallowed hard. "He's just a child." "I know," Ion said gently, "and they'll be careful. But we need his words. His truth." Miriam's eyes softened as she looked at the boy. "He's already been through so much. Which is why," Ion continued, "we're going to protect him not just with secrets, but with action." He waited, letting the meaning of his words sink in. After a moment, she asked, "What does that mean for us?" Yoon rose, brushing dust from his palms, and stood in front of her, not too close, but close enough that she didn't have to reach for reassurance. Close enough that he could see the exhaustion beneath her strength, the flickering hope beneath her fear. "It means," he said slowly, "we decide what we are. For him, for each other, for whatever future we build from here." She blinked, breath catching. "I don't know if I can. I don't know if I can." "And neither do I," he admitted softly. "But we can try." Her eyes widened with something fragile, something she had buried long before he returned. She looked down at Raffi, then back at Ion, tears gathering at the edges of her lashes. "You want to try?" "That's you with you," he said, holding her gaze. "And with him." Her lips parted, trembling. "You don't have to stay. You could walk away from this chaos and no one would blame you." "I would blame you," he said simply. "Because I see him. I see you. And I know this is where I'm meant to be." Something broke quietly inside her. The final wall, the last of the self-blame she'd clung to, the fear that she wasn't worthy of choosing again. She pressed her hand over her mouth, tears slipping past her fingers. Ion reached for her, brushing away one tear with the gentlest touch. "You didn't replace me, Miriam," he murmured. "You survived until I came home." She exhaled shakily, her shoulders trembling with the weight of released sorrow. "Well, I wanted to tell you everything the moment you walked in, but I was afraid you'd look at me differently." "I am," he said softly, "but not in the way you feared." Her eyes flickered with uncertainty. "Then how do you look at me now?" "Like someone stronger than anyone I've ever known," he whispered. "Like a woman who saved a life. Like someone I'm willing to fight for." Her breath shuddered in her chest. "And," he continued, voice gentler, I'll like the only person I want beside me when this is over. The wind stirred gently between them, lifting a strand of her hair. She didn't push it away. She didn't turn from him. She stepped closer. With Raffi between them, she rested her forehead against Ian's chest, tentatively at first. Then, with the weight of someone who had stopped pretending she didn't need support. Ian closed his eyes, inhaling the soft scent of rainwater and jasmine that clung to her, and lifted his hand to the back of her head in a quiet, grounding gesture. Raffi looked up then, confused at first, but slowly he reached out and placed a small hand over Ion's. All three stayed there, woven together by something deeper than fear or circumstance. Something chosen, not forced, not accidental, not temporary, chosen. Later, they sat on the porch while the sun dipped low. Raffi curled into Miriam's lap, and Ian sat close enough that their shoulders brushed every few minutes in soft, unintentional touches that neither pulled away from. When the breeze cooled and Raffi drifted into sleep, Miriam whispered, "I don't know what the future looks like." Ian turned toward her, his voice steady. "Then let's shape it ourselves. And if he comes back," she asked. "We face him together," he promised. "And if the town judges us, we stand together." She hesitated, searching his eyes. "And if I break again?" "And then I'll hold the pieces," he said. "Until you're strong enough to hold mine." Her eyes closed, tears slipping free. Not of fear this time, but of fragile blooming trust. When they finally went inside, Raffi stirred in her arms. His sleepy voice murmured, "Are we a family now?" Miriam faltered, unsure. Ian answered for them both. "Yes." He touched Raffi's back with a hand that trembled with quiet certainty. And they were choosing each other. The boy's lips curved into a tiny, sleepy smile. And Miriam, standing in the doorway with dusk behind her, and the warmth of a new beginning in her arms, breathed out the first peaceful exhale she had released in years. For the first time since Ian's return, she was no longer a woman fearing the past. She was a woman stepping into a future she chose, with a man who chose her back. For the first time in weeks, morning light entered the house without casting shadows of fear across the walls. It touched the edges of the worn furniture, warmed the soft rug where Raffi played, and brushed lightly against Miriam's face as she stood in the kitchen, preparing tea. Ian watched her from the doorway, quietly absorbing the way her movements had softened overnight. Not because the danger was gone, but because she was no longer carrying it alone. Raffi sat cross-legged on the floor, a row of toy stones arranged before him like a small army. He looked up every few moments, checking that both adults were still there. Each time his gaze found them, something inside him eased visibly, as though the simple act of seeing them together was a promise the world couldn't break. Ian stepped closer. "He slept better last night." Miriam glanced toward the boy, warmth flickering in her eyes. "He did. He woke only once, and when he saw you sitting nearby, he went back to sleep." Ian's chest tightened at the thought. He's starting to thought. He's starting to trust. "Both of us," she said quietly. He nodded, the weight of that responsibility settling into him, not as a burden, but as an unexpected gift. A gift he intended to protect with every choice moving forward. The door creaked open then, and Mrs. Durrani entered without ceremony, balancing a plate covered with a cloth. "Mari brought breakfast," she announced. "Hey, because none of you look like you slept enough to cook anything decent." Miriam flushed, embarrassed. "Auntie, you didn't have to." "But did," the woman cut in sternly, setting the plate down. "You're all going through hell, and I refuse to let you suffer alone." "Now move, let me sit before my knees betray me." Ian offered her the chair, which she accepted with a huff. Her voice softened when she addressed Raffi. "You come here, little one. I brought something for you." Raffi hesitated. He looked at Miriam, then Ian, then slowly approached the old woman. When she pulled out a small wooden whistle, gently carved and painted sky blue, his eyes widened with wonder. "It was my son's," she said. "And now it's yours." Raffi clutched it reverently. "Thank you." "A good boy," she murmured, kissing the top of his head. "And don't you worry, no one will take you anywhere." The kindness, the simplicity of the gesture, cracked something open inside Miriam. She blinked rapidly, wiping her cheek. The older woman noticed and squeezed her hand. "You have more allies than you think," she said firmly. "You just have to let them in." Later that afternoon, Ian took Miriam and Raffi to the district office. The lawyer he'd met earlier greeted them with a respectful nod. "I filed the initial petition," he explained. "But if we want to pursue adoption, we need to begin the paperwork." Raffi held Ian's hand tightly as they walked down the hallway. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He sensed the shift, the new direction their life was taking. In the small office, the adoption form sat on the desk like quiet promise. Miriam stared at it for a long moment, her breath trembling. I don't want to do this unless he agrees, she said softly, glancing at the child. Ian crouched beside Raffi. This paper, it helps us make sure you stay with us. Forever. Not just today. Raffi looked up at him, eyes wide and uncertain. If forever, dies you are. Ian repeated, brushing a small curl from the boy's forehead. Only if you want it. Raffi didn't answer at first. Instead, he looked between them. Miriam's tears, Ian's steady hand, the soft strength radiating from their close. Then he moved toward Ian, climbing into his lap with the quiet confidence of a child who had finally stopped running. He wrapped his arms around Ian's neck and whispered, I want to stay with you. Both of you. Ian's eyes burned as he held the boy tightly. Then that's what we'll do. The lawyer smiled warmly. We'll begin the process immediately. As signatures were placed and documents prepared, Miriam's hand brushed Ian's lightly. It wasn't a romantic gesture, not yet, but it spoke of gratitude, of trust, of choosing the same direction without needing words. When they returned home, the evening sun washed the house in gold. The light filtered through the curtains, creating a soft glow that wrapped around them like a blessing. Raffi ran into the courtyard, chasing a butterfly with a small whistle bouncing at his neck. His laughter, light, free, unguarded, rose into the air. Ian and Miriam watched from the doorway. He's changing, she whispered. He's healing, Ian corrected gently, because he feels safe now. Because he feels safe. Miriam turned her face toward him, her expression softening into something that made his heartbeat subtly shift. You gave us that. He shook his head. The simplicity of the gesture, the purity of it, broke something open inside Ian. Something that had carried guilt from battles long past, from time stolen, from years lost. Miriam watched them with quiet tenderness, the sunlight catching in her eyes. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. Her expression said everything. Gratitude for the man she had thought she'd lost forever, awe at the bond growing before her, and a deep, trembling hope she had once believed she would never feel again. That evening, when they sat down for dinner, their table felt fuller than it had in years. In tow, Raffi chattered about a stray cat he'd seen by the gate. Miriam listened with patient amusement, and Ian kept the lamp flame steady when a breeze threatened to blow it out. No one announced it, but all three understood this warmth, this ease, this shared breath was their new beginning. After the dishes were washed and the house quieted, Ian stepped outside for a moment to breathe in the night air. The sky was clear, sprinkled with stars that glowed softly like distant promises. He thought of the night he first returned home. How emptiness had filled the doorway where he expected arms of welcome. How the silence between him and Miriam had felt impenetrable. How Raffi had looked at him with fear, not familiarity. Now, when he heard footsteps behind him, he didn't tense. Miriam joined him, wrapping her shawl tighter against the breeze. You're not sleeping? She asked softly. I was thinking. She stood beside him, hands clasped together, eyes raised toward the stars. I've been thinking too. He glanced at her. She hesitated, the pause soft but waited. About the night you came back. He faced her fully then. Her hair moved gently in the night wind, her eyes illuminated by the faint glow from the window behind them. I was terrified, she whispered. Not of you, but of what you'd see when you looked at me. I thought I had lost the right to call this home yours. I thought you would walk away because I had failed you. Ian stepped closer, lowering his voice. You never failed me. She shook her head faintly. We didn't know how to tell you about Raffi. I didn't know how to tell you about the man who hunted us. I didn't know if you'd believe me. Her voice trembled. And I didn't know if you'd still want me after everything. His chest tightened, slow and aching. And Miriam, I didn't come home for a house with 4 walls. I came home for you. Her breath hitched. He continued. You think I see the past when I look at you. But I see the woman who fought alone. The woman who kept a child alive through storms. The woman who guarded a home with nothing but her courage. And I came home to that woman, not the one you think you lost. She pressed a hand to her mouth, emotions flooding her eyes. I don't deserve those words. You deserve more, he said simply. Silence settled between them, soft healing, no longer heavy. And then she reached out. Not boldly, not dramatically, just a simple trembling hand finding his in the dark. Ian held her fingers gently, closing his hand around hers with quiet certainty. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he let his cheek rest lightly on the crown of her hair. For a long while, they stood like that. Two people who had found their way back to each other through loss, storms, and truths that had nearly broken them. When they returned inside, Raffi was asleep on the sofa, his small hand clutching the edge of a blanket Ion had placed around him earlier. His lips curved in a faint smile, peaceful, dream-soft, unburdened. Miriam knelt beside him, brushing his hair lightly. "He looks happy," she whispered. "He is," Ion replied, "because he finally has a home." She looked up at him then, eyes glistening in the warm lamplight. "And so do we." Ion lifted the boy gently, Raffi curling instinctively into his chest. Miriam followed them to the bedroom, adjusting the pillows, smoothing the sheets. And when Ion laid the child down, Raffi's small hand reached out blindly until it found Ion's fingers, holding them for a moment before relaxing into sleep. A family found, not formed. Quietly, they stepped back into the hallway. Miriam reached for Ion's hand again, a gesture no longer hesitant but intentional. "When you left for war," she whispered, "I prayed every night for you to come home." He turned to her. "And now that I'm here," she met his gaze fully, the vulnerability in her eyes no longer a wound, but an offering. "And now I pray you stay." Ion touched her cheek gently, brushing away the last trace of lingering fear. "I'm not going anywhere." She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. Outside, the wind moved through the lemon tree, carrying the scent of new blossoms. Inside, the house breathed differently, steadier, warmer, alive again. This time, when Ion walked through the darkened hallway, he no longer felt like a stranger returning to a broken home. He felt like a man arriving where his heart had always belonged. And as he watched Miriam tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her eyes soft with something that looked very much like love, he realized the truth he had searched for across continents. He was home. At last, the road felt narrower than he remembered, a thin ribbon of dust stretching between sun-bleached fields and the quiet rooftops of the town he once called home. Captain Ion's boots struck the earth with a weight he hadn't felt in years. Not the physical weight of marching, but the emotional heaviness of returning to a life paused mid-breath. His heartbeat quickened as he walked past the old bakery, past the rusting water pump, past the neighbor's tree where he'd carved his initials at 17. Everything was familiar, yet touched by a silence that made it all feel slightly out of place, like a dream of home rather than home itself. The wind carried the faint rustle of laundry on clotheslines, the distant ring of a bicycle bell, and the murmur of women speaking behind half-closed doors. Life here had moved forward, gently and quietly, even while Ion was away learning to live with the sound of artillery and the cold steel scent of fear. The contrast felt sharp, almost surreal. He gripped the strap of his worn duffel bag tighter, hoping the simple pressure would stop the trembling in his fingers. And then, finally, he saw it. His house at the end of the lane, painted the same soft cream color Miriam loved, with the wooden flower boxes she used to tend every morning. The flowers were different now, blooming in unfamiliar arrangements of marigold and jasmine. Someone had taken care of them. Someone had changed them. His chest tightened with a mixture of longing and unease. He paused at the gate, letting a slow breath steady him. He had pictured this moment countless times. Miriam running to him, laughing through tears, her hands on his face, whispering that she knew he'd come home. He imagined lifting her off the ground, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, hearing her say his name the way she used to, soft and full of promise. But the door opened before he could take a step, and the scene that unfolded was nothing like the one he had carried in his heart for 3 long years. Miriam stood in the doorway, her dupatta lightly pressed against her neck, her dark hair tied back in a simple braid. Her eyes widened, but not with the warm, overwhelming joy he expected. It was something else, something hesitant, something almost afraid. Beside her, half hidden behind the folds of her dress, stood a small boy, barefoot, 4, maybe 5 years old. His big sad eyes clung to Miriam first, then flickered to Ion with a kind of nervous caution usually reserved for strangers crossing thresholds. They weren't sure we're safe, eh? The boy's small fingers gripped her tightly. Ion waited for Miriam to say his name, to run to him, to do anything that showed she was his wife, his companion, the woman who promised to wait. Instead, she inhaled sharply and whispered, "Beta, say hello." The boy peeked from behind her dress and whispered, barely audible, "Hello." Uncle, the word sliced clean through him. Uncle. Ion blinked, unsure if he had misheard. Miriam didn't correct the child. She didn't tell him this is your father. She didn't even smile. Her shoulders were tense, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed the child's hair. The silence that followed was so complete he could hear the ticking of the hallway clock inside the house. Ion forced himself to smile, a stiff, fragile thing, and stepped forward. Uncle? Uncle? No, little one. But Miriam shook her head quickly, subtly, as if warning him off from finishing the sentence. His voice faltered. Her eyes held something he could not read, a quiet panic that made the space between them feel impossibly wide. Ion lowered his duffel bag and tried again. Miriam, I'm home. She nodded once, her lips parting as if to speak, but her voice refused to obey. The boy clung tighter to her, hiding his face. And in that moment, Ion saw it. The way Miriam placed one protective arm around the child. The way she subtly positioned herself between them. The way her gaze flickered toward the street as though expecting someone else to appear. Nothing here was right. Before he could ask anything, before he could reach out to her, she whispered, "You must be tired. Come inside." Her tone was polite, formal, like speaking to a guest. He stepped into the house and the air felt different, not untouched, but rearranged. New shoes sat by the door. A child's wooden toy lay abandoned on the carpet. The faint scent of baby oil lingered in the room. Everything carried the echo of a life lived without him. He turned toward Miriam, searching her face for a trace of the woman he had left behind. But she kept her eyes lowered and guided the child into the living room, murmuring something too soft for Ion to hear. The boy glanced back at him once with wide, uncertain eyes, then hid again behind her scarf. The floor creaked faintly as Ion walked further inside. His memories of this home had always been warm, her laughter while cooking, the way she'd hum when watering plants, the evenings spent reading by lamplight. Now, those memories clashed with the scattered toys, the small drawings taped to the wall, the unfamiliar scents and shadows. He sat slowly on the edge of the sofa, unsure of whether he was allowed to touch anything. Miriam placed a glass of water on the table, her fingers brushing the rim as though trembling from holding too much weight. He looked at her, finally gathering the strength to ask, "Oh, Miriam, who is he?" Her breath caught. She hesitated for 3 full seconds, long enough for Ion to feel the space between them shift irrevocably. He's Raffi," she whispered. "He stays with me. Not our boy. Not someone," she explained, "before you walked through the door. You walked through the door." Not someone she introduced as part of their life. Just a fact placed between them like a wall. Ion leaned back slightly, studying the child's face. The way he kept his distance, the way he clung to Miriam like she was his entire world. Something inside Ion's chest tightened painfully. A coil of confusion, hurt, and rising fear. He had been gone for years, but surely not long enough to return to a wife, a child, and a life that no longer belonged to him. The boy's voice broke through the silence again, this time a little stronger. "Amoma, can I go to my room?" "Easy, Mama." Miriam's eyes widened for a brief, tortured second before she nodded and sent the child down the hallway. The small patter of his feet faded into the distance. Ion swallowed hard. "Amoma," he repeated, the word trembling in the air. Miriam shut her eyes. For the first time since he arrived, she looked like she might break. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table, her breath uneven, her voice so soft he barely heard it. "Ion, please." "Not now. Just give me time." Her plea wasn't anger. It was fear. Fear of something too big for him to understand yet. He opened his mouth to reply, but a sudden knock echoed from the street outside. A single sharp sound that made Miriam flinch violently. Anne stared at her reaction, at her fear, at the mystery tightening around them like a closing fist. And in that moment, he realized something he had not expected. He was home. Yes, but he was stepping into a story he did not yet know, a truth buried beneath silence, and a secret waiting to unravel with the slightest touch. A small spark of dread flickered through him. Nothing here was what it seemed. He turned toward the door, toward the sound, toward the beginning of a truth he wasn't ready to face, though it had been waiting for him long before he arrived. And somewhere deep inside, destiny began to move. The knock at the door faded into silence, but the unease it stirred didn't leave with it. Ion waited a moment longer, expecting Miriam to explain why she had flinched, why fear had tightened her shoulders, why the sound of a simple knock could turn her face pale. But she only murmured that it was probably a neighbor and quickly moved past him, avoiding his gaze as though even eye contact had become too heavy to bear. When she returned, her expression was calm again. Too calm, like a mask placed back into position. Ion didn't ask who it was. She didn't volunteer the answer, and between them, a quiet wall began to rise. The house felt smaller that evening, as if the walls had shifted inward during his absence. Ion placed his duffel bag in the bedroom he once shared with Miriam, noticing the subtle rearrangements. A different quilt on the bed, new curtains, unfamiliar scents mingling with faint traces of lavender she used to love. He touched the wooden dresser gently, the same one they bought in their second year of marriage. But even its surface felt changed under his palm. Everything was the same yet different, familiar yet distant, like a photograph that had aged in ways he hadn't. Dinner was a silent affair. Miriam moved quietly around the kitchen, her every gesture careful, almost rehearsed. She placed plates on the table, avoiding brushing her hand against his. The child, Raffi, sat beside her, his eyes flicking toward Ion with the cautious alertness of someone trained to fear footsteps, voices, shadows. He ate slowly, barely speaking, except for the occasional whisper to Miriam asking if he could have water or more rice. Every time he spoke, he did so softly, like someone who had been shushed too often. Ion tried to smile at him, offering a small piece of bread, but the boy shook his head and shrank closer to Miriam, clutching her sleeve. And the rejection wasn't what stung. It was the raw fear in the boy's eyes, as if Ion's presence alone was a threat. Miriam noticed and placed a gentle hand on the child's back, her eyes briefly meeting Ion's with an apology she didn't voice. After dinner, Raffi wandered to the small prayer mat near the window, kneeling with practiced familiarity. Miriam joined him, guiding his tiny hands, whispering each word with a tenderness that made Ion's chest tighten. He stood in the doorway, watching the quiet scene, a mother and child in perfect rhythm, and felt like an intruder in his own home. When the child finished and hugged Miriam, burying his face in her neck, Ion felt something shift inside him, something heavy and painful. He was supposed to be the one returning to warmth, to love, to belonging. Instead, he returned to a bond that no longer included him. Miriam carried Raffi to the bedroom across the hall, softly humming as she tucked him into bed. The door remained slightly open, letting the faint glow spill into the hallway. Ion heard her whispering a lullaby he didn't recognize, her voice steady and soothing. He leaned against the wall, his shoulders sagging, struck by the realization that Miriam had built a life with routines and rituals he had no place in. When she finally stepped out, her eyes met his just long enough for him to see the exhaustion beneath her composure. Beneath her composure. He opened his mouth to speak, to say he didn't understand, to ask what had happened to their life, to ask why the boy called him uncle and her a muma. But the words tangled in his throat. Miriam walked past him, wrapping her shawl around her tightly as though cold despite the warm night. "We'll make tea," she said quietly. He followed her into the kitchen, needing a moment of truth, however painful. "Miriam," he murmured, "I'm trying to understand. Just tell me." She placed the kettle on the stove with trembling hands. "Ion, please don't ask tonight." His jaw clenched. "How can I not ask? There's a child here. A child who calls you mama. A child who calls me uncle. You think I can just walk around this house pretending everything makes sense?" Her breath hitched, but she kept her eyes on the kettle's rising steam. "I didn't expect news of you to come the way it did," she whispered. "The people said. They said you were gone." The words lodged in his chest, heavy and bitter. "Gone?" he echoed. "Dead?" She nodded once, a tight, painful gesture. "There were reports. Rumors. I didn't know what to believe. I tried to breathe, but everything felt empty." Ian softened slightly, but confusion still wrapped around him like a tightening rope. "And the boy?" he asked gently. "Where does he fit into this?" Miriam swallowed hard, her eyes glistening for a moment before she blinked the tears away. "Ion, I will explain, but not tonight. I need time." He wanted to argue, to demand answers, to tear down the silence between them. But when he saw the raw fear flickering in her expression, he forced himself to step back. She was not hiding a betrayal. She was hiding a wound. A deep one. The kettle finally whistled. Miriam poured the tea, her hands steady now, her face carefully unreadable. She placed a cup in front of him and sat across the table, keeping just enough distance for the silence to settle uncomfortably between them. Ian stared at her, at the faint shadows beneath her eyes, at the way she pressed her lips together as if bracing herself against something only she understood. "Do you sleep?" he asked quietly. "Are you safe? Have you been safe? Have you been safe?" Miriam flinched, the tiniest movement but unmistakable. "I'm fine," she whispered. It was a lie, and they both knew it. Later, when they went to their separate rooms, a quiet decision neither questioned, the house settled into stillness. Anne lay awake in the darkness, listening to the faint rustle of curtains and the soft hum of night insects outside the window. Somewhere down the hall, Raffi let out a small whimper in his sleep, and Miriam rushed to him instantly, her footsteps soft but urgent. Her voice soothed him within seconds, a whisper meant to heal nightmares Ion couldn't yet understand. He stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of a truth hanging just out of reach. He was home, yet a stranger. He was alive, yet displaced. He was a husband, yet no longer central in the life he returned to. And as the night deepened, Ion realized something that tightened the ache in his chest. Miriam had changed because she had to. The question was why, and what shadow had pushed her into that change. That change. Somewhere in this same house, they breathed the same air, but lived in different worlds. And piece by piece, Ion felt the quiet unraveling of a story he still didn't understand. A story that had begun the moment he left, and was only now revealing its sharp edges. He closed his eyes, knowing tomorrow would bring questions he could no longer hold back, and secrets Miriam could no longer hide. The next morning arrived wrapped in a pale, muted light, the kind that softened the edges of the world but sharpened the edges inside a man's heart. Ion woke earlier than he expected, his body trained by years of war to rise before dawn. But today it wasn't discipline that pulled him from sleep. It was the lingering echo of the boy's whimper from the night before. The sound had threaded itself through his dreams, shaping them into uneasy shadows. He lay still for a moment, listening to the quietness of the house, feeling the weight of uncertainty settle over him like a second blanket. Miriam's footsteps were faint, almost hesitant, as she moved about the kitchen. Raffi's voice was softer still, a fragile murmur that drifted down the hallway like a question without an answer. Ion rose slowly, each movement careful, as though any sudden gesture might shatter the fragile peace holding the house together. When he approached the kitchen doorway, he paused, unnoticed by the two figures inside. Raffi sat at the table, legs dangling above the floor, his tiny fingers gripping the edge of his cup. Miriam blew gently on a spoonful of porridge before offering it to him, her voice warm and patient, the tone of someone who had learned to be mother and shelter both. The boy's eyes, those large, dark eyes that had regarded Ion with fear the night before, were fixed on Miriam with a devotion so intense it made something in Ion's chest twist. He stepped inside quietly, and Raffi immediately tensed, his small shoulders rising defensively, his gaze dropping to his lap. The spoon clattered slightly in Miriam's hand. She offered Ion a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I made breakfast," she said softly. "If you're hungry." "Well, yum," he replied, though hunger was the last thing he felt. He pulled out a chair across from Raffi and sat, lowering himself slowly, intentionally gentle, but the boy only shrank closer to Miriam. She stroked Raffi's hair. "It's okay," she whispered to him. "He won't hurt you." The words struck Ion harder than he expected. He won't hurt you? Why would a child need assurance of that? He forced his voice into a softer tone. "Good morning, Raffi." The boy did not respond. His small fingers fidgeted with the hem of his shirt, twisting the fabric nervously. Ion noticed a faint bruise on the boy's forearm, a shadow of purple and yellow, half hidden beneath the sleeve. His heart tightened. "How did you get that?" he asked gently. Raffi froze, his breath caught in his throat. He pulled his arm back as if expecting a blow. Miriam immediately shifted, placing herself slightly in front of him, her eyes sharp with warning. "He fell," she said too quickly. Ion held her gaze. And Miriam, she shook her head ever so slightly, not in denial, but in desperation, a plea not to push, not. The silence that followed was thin and tense. Raffi carefully lifted his cup with trembling hands, and Ion watched him closely. Every movement the boy made seemed calculated, cautious, as though he'd spent too long predicting danger, and danger was not something a child should know. Ion reached for his tea, letting the steam warm his palms. "You don't have to be scared of me," he said softly. Raffi's eyes flickered toward him for the briefest second. In that moment, Ion saw something raw and unguarded. Fear, yes, but also confusion, as if this kindness was unfamiliar territory. After breakfast, Miriam began washing the dishes, her sleeves rolled just enough for Ion to see thin stress marks on her wrists, reminders of burdens she'd carried alone. He offered to help, but she shook her head. Maybe take Raffi outside for a few minutes, she said, without turning. A fresh air might be good for him. Ion nodded, unsure whether this was her attempt to bridge a gap or simply avoid another difficult conversation. When he crouched beside the boy, he kept his voice low and steady. Would you like to show me the yard? He asked. Raffi hesitated, glancing at Miriam. She nodded encouragingly. With slow, reluctant steps, the boy followed Ion outside, keeping distance between them like a protective shield of air. The morning sun cast long shadows across the small garden, illuminating the flowers Miriam had tended in his absence. Raffi walked toward a patch of marigolds, touching a petal with reverence. Ion watched him, noting the softness in the boy's movements, the gentleness of a child who had learned to tread lightly. You like flowers? Ion asked. Raffi nodded once, still refusing to meet his eyes. Nee, my mother used to love these, Ion added, picking a fallen petal from the ground. As she said, marigolds are brave flowers. They grow even when the soil is tired. Raffi blinked at the petal, curiosity stirring behind his sadness. He reached out and took it from Ion's hand, his tiny fingers brushing Ion's palm. The touch lasted only a heartbeat, but it was the first gesture of trust. Ion allowed himself a small smile. He switched on the small bulb hanging from its frayed cord, its soft yellow glow, revealing trunks and boxes covered with thin layers of forgotten time. He didn't know what he was searching for, answers perhaps, or something that could tether him to the life he remembered, but his feet moved with purpose. He knelt beside a familiar trunk, the one with the dented corner they had inherited from Miriam's father. When he lifted the lid, he expected to see old clothes or winter blankets. Instead, he froze. Inside lay a stack of envelopes bundled tightly with a ribbon. His name was written on every one of them in Miriam's handwriting. Letters she had written during his deployment. His heart stuttered. Gently, with hands that trembled despite him willing them steady, he lifted the bundle. There were at least 30 letters, all sealed, all unopened. Ion's breath hitched, a mixture of disbelief and a deep, silent ache spreading through his chest. Why had she written these and never sent them? Or had she sent them and they simply never reached him? He loosened the ribbon and opened the first envelope. The date on it made his heart sink. Just 2 weeks after he left for the border. Ion, the nights feel too quiet without you. I heard the wind whistle through the kitchen today, and for a moment I thought it said your name. His throat tightened. He opened another. I dreamt of you again. In the dream, you returned home early, smiling, saying you missed my cooking. I woke up crying because the room was still empty. He pressed the letter to his forehead, breathing in the scent of old paper and heartbreak. These letters were fragile fragments of love and loneliness, pieces of time he never knew she had written for him. He opened a third. They say the conflict is worsening. I am trying not to be afraid. Please stay safe. Please come back to me. He read on, each letter unraveling a chapter of her quiet suffering. Nights filled with prayer, days of waiting by the radio, her fear for him growing heavier with each passing month. But then he reached the letter dated almost a year after his deployment. The first that felt different. Ion, I'm trying to be strong, but today I heard a rumor. Someone said your unit was attacked. Someone said, the sentence trailed off, unfinished except for a faint smudge, like a tear had blurred the ink. Ion's breath faltered. He opened the next. I don't know what to believe anymore. People say many things. No one knows for sure. I cannot breathe thinking of the worst. I pray every minute for one sign that you're alive. He put the letter down slowly, his vision blurring. She had lived through hell thinking he might be gone. But why had she kept these letters hidden? Why had she never told him that such rumors reached their town? He opened another. If you are alive, if God brings you home, I will never let go of you again. A sharp ache twisted through him. He wanted to go to her room at that moment. Wake her, hold her, tell her he never meant to leave her alone in that darkness. But something stopped him. A shadow beneath the letters. At the bottom of the trunk lay another stack, this time addressed to her. Letters he had written during the war. Every one of them unopened. Dozens. His heart dropped. Hands numb, he picked up one envelope. The date matched the first month of his deployment. His handwriting, hurried and uneven from writing in a tent under dim lantern light, stared back at him. He tore it open. "Hey, Miriam, the nights here are cold, but what keeps me warm is imagining you waiting for me by the window when I return. I keep thinking of the way you smiled the morning I left." He swallowed hard. Why had she never read this? Another letter. "Now they tell us to be ready for movement soon. If anything happens, know that I loved you more than every sunrise I watched on patrol." He opened a third, dated nearly a year after the first. "You haven't heard from you. Not a single letter. I worry something is wrong. Or maybe my letters aren't reaching you." Ion's hands shook. If his letters never reached her, if her letters never reached him, then the silence between them these past 3 years had been neglect. It had been destruction. He stared at the stacks, feeling as though someone had torn years out of their marriage and locked them in this attic. His breathing grew unsteady as he whispered into the quiet, "Miriam, why didn't you tell me?" But deep inside, another question echoed louder. Who had kept these letters from her? Who had kept her letters from him? Was it deliberate? He thought of the child's bruise, of the fear in Miriam's eyes, of the knock at the door that made her flinch, of Raffi trembling at the sound of a car, of Miriam saying she needed time, of her saying she didn't know if she could trust yet. Was the truth she feared tied to the silence? A floorboard creaked behind him. He turned quickly, half expecting someone to be there, but the attic remained still. Only the bulb flickered faintly, casting trembling shadows across the wooden beams. Ion gathered the letters, both hers and his, and tied them back into 2 separate bundles. He held them against his chest, the weight of them heavier than any weapon he had carried in war. These weren't just letters. They were stolen years, lost confessions, fragmented love, and a warning that someone had interfered. As he descended the ladder, the house seemed darker, quieter, as though it sensed something shifting. He paused at the bottom, listening to the night breathing around him. Miriam's room was silent, but for the soft rhythm of her sleep. Raffi's small snores floated faintly through his door. Ion looked at the letters one more time, the truth unfolding slowly, painfully. Someone had isolated them from each other. Someone had pulled apart their lives long before he returned. And whoever it was, whatever reason they had, it wasn't finished yet. Ion exhaled slowly, the weight of his next steps already taking shape. Something about this house, this boy, this silence, was far larger than coincidence. And tomorrow, he would begin uncovering the truth one piece at a time, even if it meant unraveling the very world he had returned to save. The letters stayed on Ion's bedside table through the night, their presence a silent reminder of everything stolen from him and from Miriam. Sleep never came easily. When it finally did, it arrived in broken fragments, heavy with questions that continued to twist through his mind like restless shadows. By morning, he felt the weight of exhaustion sitting behind his eyes, but he forced himself up, driven by a need to find answers buried deeper than lost words. Miriam greeted him quietly, her expression swollen with sleeplessness. Raffi clung to her dupatta as though it were the only safe anchor in a shifting world. When the boy looked at Ion, his wary gaze held less fear and more confusion, as if he sensed something had changed in the air. And maybe it had. There was new tension now, unspoken, but palpable, wrapped around the house like a thin layer of frost. Breakfast was quiet. Miriam's hands shook only once when she poured water, but she quickly steadied herself. Ion noticed, filing it away silently. He ate slowly, letting the rhythm of spoon against bowl fill the gap where their conversations used to be. Every few moments he glanced at Raffi, whose small fingers traced the rim of his cup, as if comforting himself with the circular motion. When breakfast ended, Miriam guided Raffi to his room for a nap, leaving Ion to breathe in the heavy quiet of the kitchen. His eyes drifted to the hallway to the attic door, as if something were pulling him back toward secrets he didn't yet understand. But he resisted. The attic had given him letters, pain, lost years. Now he needed something else, something that would clarify why those letters were hidden in the first place. He began moving through the house with slow, deliberate steps, searching for any sign of the life Miriam had lived without him. Drawers held nothing but clothes and carefully folded linens. Shelves contained familiar books, though arranged differently. But it wasn't until he reached the small room beside the kitchen, a room once used for storage, that something caught his eye. A wooden cabinet stood slightly ajar. He approached and gently pulled it open. Inside were stacks of old notebooks, a few broken toys, and a metal tin filled with sewing supplies. As he sorted through the items, something slipped out from between two journals and fluttered to the floor. A photograph. Ion froze. Even before he picked it up, something in his chest tightened with a strange, unsettling recognition. He knelt and lifted the image carefully, as though it might crumble under the weight of what it represented. The picture showed Miriam standing in the courtyard near the old market. Her eyes were half shaded by sunlight, her smile faint but present, a smile he hadn't seen in years. And beside her stood a man, not Ion, a stranger. The man was young, possibly in his late 20s. His posture was relaxed, too familiar for comfort, his shoulder almost brushing Miriam's. His expression wasn't warm, not affectionate, but something about it felt possessive, watching, claiming. Ion stared at the back of the photograph, where a small date was written in smudged ink. 17 months after his deployment, well into the time Miriam had believed him dead. His pulse tightened. He tried to recall the face. Had he seen this man before? In town? In passing? No, something about the sharpness of the man's jaw and the coldness in his eyes felt entirely unfamiliar. Yet, there was something else. A detail so subtle Ion almost missed it. Miriam's hands. Her fingers were knotted around the strap of her bag. The tension in her shoulders was visible even through the stillness of the image. She wasn't comfortable beside him. If anything, she looked cornered. A cold ripple passed through Ian's chest. He turned the photograph over again, studying the image carefully. The man's hand was lifted ever so slightly, as if he had just touched Miriam's arm or was about to. Her leaning away looked subtle, almost invisible, unless one knew how she moved when she felt uneasy. Ian knew. Footsteps sounded softly behind him. He stiffened and turned. Miriam stood in the doorway, her expression draining of color as her eyes fell on the photograph in his hand. Her breath halted, barely audible, and in that moment, Ian saw not guilt, but fear, deep, raw fear. Deep, raw fear. "Where did you find that?" she whispered. He held the picture up, keeping his tone steady. "It was in the cabinet. Why was it hidden?" Miriam stepped back without realizing it, her fingers gripping the edge of the doorframe for support. "Leon, please put it away. That man," he pressed gently. "Who was he?" Her eyes darted toward the hallway where Rafi slept, as though even the name of the stranger could summon something unwelcome into their home. She folded her arms tightly around herself, shaking her head. "It's nothing," she whispered. "He's no one." Ion exhaled slowly, fighting the urge to push too hard. "Miriam, this picture was taken while I was gone. You look frightened in it." She shut her eyes, and her voice came out strained. "You don't understand. Even help me understand," he urged, taking a step closer. "I'm not here to judge you. I just want the truth." She opened her eyes and stared at him, eyes filled with conflict, pain, and something that looked dangerously close to surrender. But before she could speak, a sudden cry echoed down the hallway. Mama. Rafi's voice trembled with terror. Miriam's entire body jolted. She ran toward his room so quickly that her shawl nearly slipped from her shoulders. Ian followed, heart pounding. When they reached the doorway, they found Rafi curled on his bed, shaking violently as though waking from a nightmare too vivid to escape. Miriam gathered him into her arms at once, rocking him gently. "I'm here, Beta. I'm here. Beta, I'm here. It's okay. No one is here. No one is here. No one is here." Not "it's just a dream." Not "you're safe with us." No, it was a reassurance meant for a child afraid of someone specific. Someone who could walk through a door. Someone who might come back. Rafi clung to Miriam, his tiny hands gripping her as though trying to disappear inside her embrace. His eyes flicked once toward the window, toward the street, toward something unseen that haunted him. Ian knelt slowly beside them. Rafi, you're safe. I promise," the boy whispered through shaky breaths. Please don't let him take me." Ian felt the ground tilt beneath him. He glanced at Miriam. Her face had gone pale, her hands trembling around the child she held like a shield. Rafi buried his face into her neck and cried. And in that moment, as Ian knelt there with the photograph still clutched in his hand, the weight of understanding settled into his chest like cold stone. The stranger wasn't a memory, not an acquaintance, not a harmless figure from Miriam's lonely days. This was someone tied to Rafi's terror, someone whose shadow still stretched toward their lives. Ian looked again at the photograph, at the man's expression, at Miriam's hidden fear. This was the beginning of the truth. And the truth, he realized, was far darker than he had ever imagined. The rest of the day passed with a heaviness that clung to every corner of the house. Rafi refused to leave Miriam's side after his nightmare, gripping her fingers with the desperation of someone who feared even the air might turn into danger. Ion tried to give them space, yet every moment he watched them only deepened the knot that had begun forming in his chest. The photograph lay hidden in his pocket, its edges warm from being held too tightly. He felt its presence like a pulse, an echo of a question he still had no answer to. As evening crept in and shadows lengthened along the walls, the atmosphere grew denser, as though the house itself sensed that a reckoning was approaching. Rafi finally calmed enough to draw quietly at the table, his crayons scattered around him in soft disarray. He sketched circles, lines, shapes that made no sense at first glance. But every few minutes he glanced toward the window as though expecting someone to appear outside. Each glance was small, but it was enough. Enough to tell Ion the boy had learned to fear a silhouette more than darkness. Miriam stood in the kitchen preparing tea, her movements slow and distracted. The kettle hissed faintly. Her hands trembled again, though she did her best to hide it. Ion watched her from the doorway, trying to read the emotions she kept locked behind her lowered gaze. Miriam, he began quietly, I need you to tell me what's happening. The photograph, the letters, Rafi's fear, it's all connected, isn't it? She didn't turn around. Some truths hurt more when spoken, and some wounds get deeper when you try to hide them, he replied. Busts. She shut her eyes as if bracing herself. Not tonight, Ion, please. He exhaled slowly. You said that every night since I returned, and I wasn't lying, she whispered. Some nights I'm not strong enough. The ache behind her voice softened something inside him. He stepped closer, lowering his tone. Then let me be strong for you. She stiffened, not in rejection, in fear, in warning. Don't say that. You don't understand the danger. And then explain it to me, he urged. Before she could answer, the back door rattled softly, a wind maybe, or something brushing against it. But the sound made Miriam flinch so sharply the spoon fell from her hand. Clattering against the counter, Rafi jerked his head up instantly, eyes wide. His small body went rigid, terror flooding through him like a reflex buried deep in bone. Ion moved toward the door, but Miriam stepped in front of him so quickly it startled him. No, she said, breathless, her fingers clutching his arm. I'll leave it. Miriam, it's probably nothing. No, she repeated, her voice barely holding together. Please, don't. Her fear was too real, too raw. Ion slowly backed away, letting the moment settle, though his instincts burned for answers. Miriam waited until the house grew still again, then gently ushered Rafi toward his room, whispering assurances too soft for Ion to hear. When she returned, her eyes were red, her face pale. He didn't push her again. Hours passed. Night fell fully. Rafi finally slept after much coaxing, though his tiny fingers clutched a toy soldier as if it were a shield. Miriam lingered beside him until his breathing softened into peaceful rhythm. Only then did she step out into the living room where sat waiting. He motioned for her to sit. She hesitated, but eventually lowered herself onto the opposite end of the sofa, hands folded tightly in her lap. The lamplight cast a soft glow on her face, illuminating the exhaustion that had etched itself into her features. For 3 years, Ion said slowly, I believed you had moved on with your life. But these last days, I see it wasn't that. You've been surviving something terrifying. She closed her eyes, shoulders trembling. Yearn? I wanted to tell you everything the moment you walked through that door. But I looked at you, and I saw the man I loved, the man I prayed for, the man I thought was dead. I didn't know how to break you with this truth, not when you had just come home. His breath caught. Miriam, I can bear anything if you tell me. What I can't bear is being left outside the door of your life. She looked at him then, really looked, and in her eyes he found grief, guilt, love, and panic woven together in a way that made his chest tighten. I never betrayed you, she whispered. You know, he said without hesitation, I never loved anyone else. I believe you. Her lips quivered with a shaky exhale. But betrayal doesn't always come from love, he frowned confused. Before she could explain, a sudden noise echoed through the night. A distant engine revving on the road outside, too loud, too familiar. Rafi stirred in the bedroom, crying out in his sleep, the fear still alive inside him. Miriam paled, her breath turning shallow. No, she whispered. Not tonight. Please. Ion stood immediately. Who is it? She shook her head frantically, as though even speaking the truth would summon danger. Ion, please. Sit down. Stay inside. Don't go near the window. He stepped closer, voice steady but firm. Miriam, who is it? Tears welled in her eyes, threatening to break the dam of silence she had held for so long. She pressed a hand over her mouth. Not the uncertain knock of someone seeking help. This one carried ownership. Warning, claim. Miriam went rigid, frozen mid-breath. Raffi began crying harder. Ion moved instinctively toward the door, but she grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. No, don't open it, she pleaded. If you open it, he'll never stop. Who? Her voice trembled. The man in the photograph. Ion's heart hammered against his ribs. Why is he here? He asked, his voice low and dangerous now. Miriam swallowed, tears spilling, and he thinks Raffi belongs to him. Ian felt the world tilt, the truth flickering at the edge of revelation. What does he want? He asked. Her voice barely rose above a breath. To take him back. The knock came again, harder this time, rattling the wood. Raffi sobbed from the bedroom, calling out for Miriam. Ion's fists tightened. Miriam, tell me what he did. Tell me why Raffi fears him. She finally broke, not with words at first, but with a shudder so deep it looked like her body was collapsing under years of weight. When she lifted her eyes, they shone with terror and a silent plea for protection she no longer knew how to ask for. That night, she whispered. The night I thought you were dead. I found Raffi alone, abandoned, hurt, crying, and he was looking for his mother. Ian felt a chill climb his spine. His mother? Miriam nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. She was running from him, the man in the photograph, and she didn't make it. Ion's blood ran cold. She died protecting him, Miriam said, voice cracking. And when I held Raffi for the first time, he looked at me like he had no one left. Her breath trembled. I couldn't walk away. Another knock, violent this time, made the lamp flicker. Ion stepped in front of Miriam, shielding her instinctively. And he wants to take the child? He thinks Raffi is his property, she cried. Not his son. His possession. Ian felt fury burn through him, quiet but deadly. He took a slow breath, grounding himself. He won't take him, he said firmly. Miriam looked up. He won't take you, he added. He won't take you, he added. Her eyes flooded, but now there was something else in them. Relief, fragile yet fierce. Outside, footsteps circled the house. Ian clenched his jaw. That night, everything changed. Not because darkness had arrived, but because Ion finally saw the shape of the enemy hiding within it. He turned off the lamp, placing a finger to his lips, signaling silence as he stepped toward the door. Somewhere deep inside, the soldier in him woke. Not the man who fought wars far from home, but the man who now had something worth protecting with his life. Someone had come for what wasn't his, and Ion was no longer unprepared. The night stretched long after the knocking stopped, but none of them slept. Raffi remained curled in Miriam's lap long past midnight, his tiny fists gripping her sleeve as though any loosened touch might let danger seep through the cracks of the house. Ion sat near the door, his back straight, the soldier in him fully awake, listening for footsteps, engines, voices, anything that hinted the stranger might still linger outside, but the road grew quiet, the silence so complete it felt like an uneasy truce rather than safety. When dawn finally crept in, pale and muted, Miriam's eyes were still wide open. She hadn't slept. Raffi had, only because exhaustion had finally overpowered fear. His breathing was now slow and uneven, his head resting against her chest. The faint rise and fall of his small body stirred something deep in Ion, a mixture of protection and dread, both tightening around him like invisible threads. He waited until sunlight softened the room before speaking. His voice was low, gentle, but steady. Kitty, no need to talk. Miriam stiffened. Her fingers kept moving through Raffi's hair as though stopping would break her. He continued, I'm not asking to punish you or blame you. I'm asking because what happened last night isn't something we can ignore. Her breaths came shallow, uneven. I know. You said that man thinks Raffi belongs to him. She nodded silently. You said the boy's mother died running from him. Another nod, this one trembling. And you said he came back for the child. Again. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. And Miriam, how many times has he tried? She swallowed hard, her throat tightening visibly. Twice before last night, the answer hit him like a blow. So this man has been near you, near Raffi, multiple times, and you never told anyone? I couldn't, she whispered harshly, finally lifting her face. The fear in her eyes was raw, shaking. He said if I told anyone, he would come at night. He said he'd take Raffi so quietly no one would hear. He said he'd make sure no one found him again. Ian, Ian felt the temperature inside him drop. You believed him. I saw what he did to Rafi's mother, she whispered. I believed every word. The room thickened with silence. Ian lowered himself onto the sofa, his jaw tight, his voice gentler than he felt. A start from the beginning. I need you to tell me the truth. All of it? She looked down at the sleeping child in her arms. Ian, if I tell you everything, you might hate me. I won't, he said firmly. For a moment, she just stared at Rafi, tracing the curve of his cheek as though memorizing him. Then she inhaled slowly, gathering strength. You remember the night the rumor spread that you'd been killed? She began softly, her voice cracking. It broke something inside me. I didn't know how to breathe. I didn't know how to live. I kept walking through the town like I was underwater, hearing things, seeing faces, but none of it felt real. Ian nodded, feeling the ache of knowing her suffering only now. That night, she continued, it rained. Hard. Storm winds were shaking the trees, and lights kept flickering across the street. I went outside because I couldn't stay in the house where everything reminded me of you. I walked toward the old bus station without knowing why. She paused, her lips trembling, and then I heard crying, faint, like a wounded animal. Her hands tightened around Rafi. It was him, Rafi. Soaked, shivering, alone. His clothes were dirty, torn. He had blood on his forehead. He kept saying, Amy, Amy, please come back. And when he saw me, he ran toward me. Not because he knew me, because he was desperate. Ian felt his chest hollow out. I picked him up, trying to calm him, she said. But he kept pointing toward the road, so I followed him. And then I saw her. A shiver ran through her body. A woman collapsed behind the station, barely breathing. She had scratches on her face, bruises on her neck. She saw her child in my arms and tried to reach him, but her hands, they shook too much. Tears fell silently down Miriam's cheeks. Oh, she whispered something, she said. She whispered something, she said. At first I couldn't hear. She pulled me closer and said, please, keep him safe. Don't let him go back. And then she stopped breathing. Ian closed his eyes, grief for a stranger blooming in his chest. That was the night, Miriam whispered. The night everything changed. And the man? Ian asked quietly. He arrived minutes later, she said, her voice trembling. He came running around the corner, yelling at the woman for trying to escape. He didn't even check if she was alive. He only looked at Rafi. Her breath hitched. He told me to hand the boy over. His voice, Ian, it didn't sound human. It sounded like someone who felt he owned him. What did you do? You ran, she whispered. I ran through the storm with Rafi in my arms. He chased us for blocks, yelling that I'd regret it. When I reached home, the neighbors came out because of the noise. He couldn't drag the child away in front of witnesses, so he left. But before he got into his car, he looked at me with the coldest smile I've ever seen and said, You can't hide him forever. Onan's fists clenched. And then he came back weeks later, she said. Stood outside the house. Said he'd return when things quieted. The second time he knocked. Calmly, like last night, he kept repeating that the boy was his. That the woman was nothing. That he had rights to take him. Ian's voice sharpened. Did you ever go to the police? She wiped her cheeks with shaking hands. Maybe I should have, but I was alone. You were gone. And the rumor of your death, it shattered me. I didn't trust my strength. I didn't trust the system. All I knew was that Rafi needed me. And if his mother died protecting him, how could I abandon him? You hid all of this from me when I returned, he said softly. Not accusing, but wounded. Her voice broke. I thought you'd think I replaced you, that I reached for another life when I thought I lost you. People in town whispered things. I didn't want you to look at me with doubt. I don't, he said instantly. She looked away, barely believing it. Ian leaned closer, lowering his voice. Why does Rafi call you Mama? Her breath trembled. Because he started calling me that on his own. One morning he woke up from a nightmare, crying for his mother, and when he saw me, he whispered it. I never corrected him. How could I? Her tears fell again. He lost everything in one night. Ian stared at the child sleeping peacefully on her lap. And you told him I'm uncle? She nodded with shame. I didn't know how to explain you. I didn't want to confuse him. I didn't know what you'd feel seeing a child in our home who wasn't yours. Ian exhaled, pain deepening behind his ribs. Miriam, the letters, both ours. Someone kept them from us. Do you think it was him? Her eyes widened slowly. Yes, she whispered. He was around the neighborhood weeks after I found Rafi. He asked questions. He spoke to people. Maybe he... Oh, God. Ian understood now. The silence between them these past years wasn't distance. It was engineered. He took a slow breath. And Miriam, listen to me carefully. Whatever lie you think you told, it wasn't betrayal. It was survival. You saved this child, and you protected yourself in the only way you knew. Her face crumpled with relief and guilt woven together. You're not alone anymore, he said firmly. I'm here now, and I'm not letting him come near either of you again. She closed her eyes, a sob trembling through her. And for the first time since he returned, she leaned toward him, not as a woman hiding a secret, but as someone finally letting go of fear she had carried far too long. Rafi stirred softly, rolling against her chest, and Miriam tightened her embrace. Ion watched them, the truth settling heavy and sharp inside him. The lie she carried wasn't a betrayal. It was a shield, and starting now, he would be the one holding it. Morning arrived without warmth. The sun climbed over the rooftops, but its light felt thin, washed out, as if even dawn sensed the fragile tension inside the house. Rafi slept late after the night's terrors, curled against Miriam as though she were the last safe place in a world full of shadows. Ion sat by the living room window, the photograph in his hand, his jaw tight with a resolve that had grown sharper with every passing hour. He wasn't just dealing with a frightened child or a haunted wife anymore. There was a man out there, dangerous, determined, and close. And he wanted Rafi back. And Ion didn't know why. Not yet, but he intended to. When Rafi finally woke, Miriam brought him into the living room, holding him on her hip. The boy blinked sleepily, his face still puffy from crying. When he spotted Ion, he tensed for a moment, habit and not fear anymore. Then his small fingers tugged quietly at Miriam's sleeve. Is he gone? Rafi whispered. Ion forced his voice to stay gentle. Yes, he's gone. Rafi watched him, unsure whether to believe or fear, and hid his face again. Miriam stroked his hair, but the tremble in her hand betrayed the truth. She didn't know if the man was gone or simply waiting. After breakfast, Ion told Miriam he needed to check something. She insisted on going with him, but he shook his head. Stay with Rafi, he said softly. He needs you. Her eyes flickered with worry. Where are you going? To find out who's been watching our house. Her breath caught. Ion, be careful. He gave her a small nod and stepped outside. He walked slowly down the street, scanning the road, the alleyways, the scattered neighbors who pretended not to stare too long. The wind carried faint dust across the ground. It was a quiet lane. Too quiet for someone to linger unnoticed. Unless they knew where to hide. He reached the corner where the street met the main road. That's where he saw it. Tire marks. Fresh. Deep. The kind left behind by someone braking hard. Someone who had parked in a hurry, waited and left again in the middle of the night. Ion crouched, running his fingers over the grooves in the dust. His mind replayed the knocking, the footsteps circling the house, the engine revving away when dawn approached. He rose slowly, looking down the road. Whoever the man was, he had been close enough to see the windows, the doors, the faces inside. Close enough to see Rafi. He turned back toward the house, thoughts swirling into grim clarity. Whoever kept the letters from reaching them, whoever followed Miriam the night she found Rafi, wasn't finished. The man wasn't just trying to reclaim something he believed belonged to him. He was monitoring them, waiting for a moment of weakness. Ion's steps quickened. Inside, he found Miriam sitting at the table with Rafi drawing quietly beside her. She looked up the moment he entered, eyes searching his face for answers. What did you find? She asked. Ion glanced at Rafi, then approached her. Not here, Dater. But her hand grabbed his sleeve, desperate. Please, Ion. No more secrets between us. He exhaled and lowered his voice. He was parked on the main road, watching, waiting. The color drained from her face. He'll come back. He might, Ion admitted. But not if I make sure he doesn't come near this house again. Before Miriam could respond, a sharp knock echoed from the front door. This time it wasn't violent. It wasn't coercive. It was controlled, meant to be polite, which was far worse. Rafi froze, his crayon dropping from his hand. Ion stood instantly, motioning Miriam to keep the child close. Her arms wrapped around Rafi, shielding him as she carried him into the hallway. The boy buried his face in her neck, trembling. Ion walked to the door and opened it just enough to see who stood outside. A man leaned casually against the gatepost, arms crossed, a faint smirk on his lips. It was unmistakably the man from the photograph. Sharp jaw, slick dark hair, cold, assessing eyes. He looked exactly as he had appeared in the picture. Calm on the surface, something dangerous simmering underneath. "Good morning, Captain," the man said, his voice smooth, too controlled. Or should I say, "Welcome home." Ian stepped outside, closing the door behind him. "You know who I am." "You know who I am?" "Me, of course." The man smiled. "Everyone here knew you were deployed. Some even believed you died. Funny how rumors travel." "Not as funny as the truth," Ian replied.